He thought he was inheriting an apartment, not a silence that had been waiting for him. One room was always locked, and the key only worked at exactly 3:17 in the morning. The neighbors wouldn't talk, the lawyer wanted the place sold, and someone was watching the door. His dog never barked, it only sat guard, as if remembering a night everyone else tried to forget. What opened at 3:17 wasn't just a room, but a truth someone had tried to burn away. This is a story about memory, responsibility, and the quiet courage to choose people over proof. If stories like this matter to you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Elias Crow entered the apartment the way a man steps into a place that has already memorized him. Not cautiously, not boldly, just quietly, with the practiced economy of someone who had learned long ago that noise wasted energy and attention invited mistakes. The door closed behind him with a soft, well-oiled click, and the silence inside did not echo. It absorbed. The air smelled clean, not freshly cleaned, not perfumed, simply absent of neglect. No mildew, no dust haloing the window frames. Even the floorboards bore the faint sheen of care, as if someone had wiped them down not in haste, but with time to spare. Too much time. Elias stood there for a moment longer than necessary, his broad shoulders squared, his posture straight by habit rather than effort. At 40, he still carried the build of a man shaped by function rather than display. Tall, solid, wide through the shoulders, his strength settled inward, contained. His skin bore the dull bronze of long exposure to harsh climates, the kind that didn't fade with rest. His hair was cut short in a tactical military style, tight along the sides, slightly longer on top, brown darkened by early gray at the temples. His beard was trimmed close, disciplined, framing a jaw that looked carved more than grown. His eyes, a muted blue-gray, scanned the room with a calm vigilance that came not from fear, but from habit, the reflex of a man who had learned that safety was temporary and awareness was permanent. Behind him, Morrow stepped inside and stopped. The German Shepherd was large, 7 years old by the papers Elias carried, though age sat differently on a working dog. Morrow's body was long and balanced, his back straight and strong, chest deep, legs planted with quiet authority. His coat was the classic black and tan, dense and close to the body, dark across the back and shoulders, warming into amber along the chest and legs. His ears stood erect, angled forward, not twitching, not restless. He did not sniff. He did not circle. He simply sat, directly facing the locked door at the end of the hall. Morrow did not bark. He did not whine. He did not lean into Elias for reassurance. His stillness was deliberate, the kind that came from training and memory rather than instinct alone. His amber-brown eyes fixed on the door with a focus that felt less like curiosity and more like recognition. Elias noticed but did not comment. He had learned long ago not to interrupt a soldier at attention, no matter the species. The will had been brief, brutally so. Arthur Hale had not been a man who wasted words, even in death. Elias remembered him vaguely, a square-built older man with steady hands and a voice that always sounded like it had already considered the consequences before speaking. They had not been close, not by blood or affection. Hale had been a colleague once, adjacent rather than intimate, connected through systems rather than stories. When Elias had been notified of the inheritance, he had assumed it was a clerical mistake. The note attached to the will had proven otherwise. Do not open the locked room during daylight hours. Use this key only at exactly 3:17 a.m. No explanation, no apology, no sentiment. That night, Elias unpacked methodically. Gear first, clothes second, personal items last. The apartment did not resist his presence. It accepted it. Around midnight, he sat on the couch. Morrow settled nearby, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound marking time's passage. The digital clock on the wall glowed a dull green, 12:58 a.m. Elias closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the room felt different. Not colder, not warmer, just alert. The clock read 3:17 and did not move. No flicker, no hum, no progression to 3:18. The second indicator, absent entirely, as if the device itself had agreed that this minute required no subdivision. Elias stood slowly. His pulse was steady. Fear was not what rose in him. It was recognition. The kind that said, this was planned. Morrow did not move. He sat exactly where he had been before, eyes locked on the door, ears forward, spine straight. The posture of a guard who had not been relieved. Morning came eventually. Time resumed its duties without apology. Sunlight poured through the windows, pale and northern, catching on the clean lines of the apartment. Outside, the building stirred awake. Doors opened, footsteps echoed, voices murmured. Elias took Morrow out for a walk. The neighbors watched, not openly, not rudely, just enough to be noticed. An older woman paused too long by the mailboxes. A man on the stairs stopped to retie a shoe that did not need tying. Their eyes slid away when Elias met them, but not before something passed between them. A question they had learned not to ask aloud. Later that morning, there was a knock. Colin Ward stood in the doorway with a clipboard held like a shield. He was in his early 50s, tall but slightly stooped, his hair thinning and combed back in a way that suggested effort rather than confidence. His clothes were neat, utilitarian, chosen to blend in the hallways rather than command rooms. His eyes darted once, to Morrow, to the end of the hall, before returning to Elias. "Mr. Crow," he said, offering a tight smile. "I'm the building manager. Just wanted to welcome you. And, go over a few safety protocols." His voice carried the brittle politeness of someone reciting lines he did not believe protected him anymore. When Elias said nothing, Colin cleared his throat. "There's a locked room listed on the original floor plan. We'll need to inspect it. Regulations." Elias looked at him steadily. "It stays locked." Colin's jaw tightened. "That room is associated with an incident." "So am I," Elias replied evenly. Colin left soon after, relief and frustration warring in his posture as he retreated down the hall. That afternoon, Victor Lang arrived. Lang was in his late 40s, well-dressed in a charcoal suit that fit too well to be local. His beard was close-cropped, his hair dark and neatly parted, his expression polished into something resembling concern. He carried a leather briefcase and the confidence of a man accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around him. "Mr. Crow," Lang said, extending a hand that Elias did not take. "I represent distant family interests connected to Mr. Hale's estate." Elias waited. Lang smiled, then sighed softly, as if burdened by reason. "The conditions in the will are irregular, potentially unenforceable. It would be in everyone's best interest to liquidate the property quickly, cleanly." "Not interested." Lang's eyes flicked just once toward the hallway. "That room is a liability." "So is lying," Elias said. Lang left without another word. That evening, Elias stood before the locked door. The key was old, heavy in his hand, its teeth worn smooth with use. He inserted it into the lock. It did not turn. The mechanism resisted completely, dead, inert, like stone. Elias applied pressure, then stopped. Forcing a lock was not courage, it was impatience. He stepped back. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the apartment's lights flickered once. Somewhere deep in the building, an electrical system reset, old infrastructure sighing into its designated rhythm. The lock turned. Not freely, not easily, but it yielded, as if recognizing the hour rather than the hand. Elias did not open the door. On the third night, he was awake. The clock glowed, 3:17. Footsteps sounded in the hallway outside, measured, cautious. Not a resident's shuffle, not security's tread. Morrow rose silently and positioned himself between Elias and the door. His lips curled just enough to show restraint, not threat. A low sound vibrated in his chest, felt more than heard. The footsteps paused, then retreated. A scent lingered beneath the doorframe, cheap cologne layered over something sharper, metal, intent. Elias knelt beside Morrow, resting a hand briefly against the dog's thick neck. The warmth there was steady, alive. Someone was watching, and someone was afraid of what waited on the other side of the door. Time moved again, but Elias knew now. Some minutes were never meant to pass. Daylight changed the city without changing its heart. In the pale northern morning, the streets looked honest. Maple trees lining the sidewalks, their leaves just beginning to yellow, the air crisp enough to sharpen the edges of sound. People walked dogs, coffee shops opened their doors. The lake beyond the residential blocks reflected the sky with a calm that felt earned. From a distance, it was the kind of town people described as quiet when they meant safe. Yet Elias Crow felt the difference the moment he stepped outside with Morrow at his side. The brightness did not erase what lingered beneath it. It only made the shadows more deliberate. As they walked, Elias noticed how conversations shifted the instant he came near. A woman paused mid-sentence to greet him politely, then redirected her words toward the weather. A man watering his front steps nodded, then turned his attention with exaggerated focus to the hose. The avoidance was practiced, almost courteous. No one stared. No one asked questions. The year of the fire, spoken of only as that year, hung in the air like a topic everyone had silently agreed to abandon. Elias recognized the pattern. He had seen it before in places where something terrible had happened, and people had survived by not naming it. Morrow moved steadily at his side, leash slack, his gait smooth and purposeful. He did not pull toward strangers or bark at passing cars. His ears remained forward, occasionally flicking as if tuning to frequencies Elias could not hear. When they passed the older brick building across the street, the one that bore faint discoloration high along its exterior wall, Morrow slowed. His nose lifted slightly, his breathing changed. It was subtle, but Elias caught it. Smoke. Old smoke. Embedded so deeply into stone and insulation that most humans had long stopped noticing it. Back inside the apartment building, Elias encountered Colin Ward again near the elevator. In daylight, the building manager looked smaller than he had the day before. His suit jacket hung a little loose, his shoulders drawn inward as though trying to reduce the space he occupied. His hair, thinning and carefully combed, revealed a scalp more vulnerable than the man seemed to realize. He greeted Elias with the same careful smile, clipboard tucked against his chest like a lifeline. "Mr. Crow," Colin said, glancing briefly at Morrow before forcing himself to meet Elias's eyes. "I wanted to follow up about that room." Elias waited. Colin cleared his throat. "The building's systems are old, some of them. We've made upgrades over the years, of course, safety improvements, modern compliance." He spoke quickly now, words overlapping, as if speed could substitute for clarity. "That locked room, it's connected to older wiring, older ventilation. If something were to happen—" "Like before?" Elias asked, not unkindly. Colin flinched. Just slightly, enough. "That was a long time ago," Colin said, his voice tightening. "Different management, different standards." "And the doors?" Elias pressed. Colin's fingers tightened around the clipboard. "All doors meet code," he said too quickly. "They always have." Morrow shifted his weight. His nails clicked softly against the tile. Colin's eyes dropped to the dog, then darted away. "You'll let us inspect the room eventually," he said, more a hope than a statement. "Eventually," Elias replied, non-committal. That afternoon, Victor Lang called. Lang's voice carried the same smooth assurance it had in person.
each word polished to sound reasonable. He spoke of liability, of precedent, of the danger of acting outside established legal channels. He reminded Elias that the will's conditions could be challenged, that courts did not look kindly on irregularities tied to safety hazards.
He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply laid out consequences as though they were natural laws rather than choices. "You don't want to be responsible for reopening old wounds," Lang said. "Some things stay buried for a reason." Elias looked out the window as Lang spoke, watching Morrow lie on the floor, his chest rising and falling in an even rhythm. "Wounds don't stay buried," Elias said. "They fester." Lang paused. "Think about it," he said, and ended the call. Later, Elias rode the elevator down to the basement level, following a quiet instinct rather than a plan. The maintenance corridor smelled of dust and cleaning solution, fluorescent lights humming overhead. At the far end, a man worked on an electrical panel, his back turned. He was in his late 50s, lean to the point of gauntness, his posture bent slightly forward, as though years of reaching into tight spaces had shaped him. His hair was gray and thinning, his beard untrimmed, peppered with white. When he turned, his eyes were sharp and restless, darting first to Elias, then immediately to Morrow. The man stiffened. His name tag read Frank Delaney. "Can I help you?" Frank asked, his tone guarded. Elias shook his head. "Just looking around." Frank's gaze lingered on Morrow, who had stopped several feet away. The dog's ears were forward, his body still. He did not growl, he did not approach. He simply watched. Frank swallowed. "That dog," he said, his voice rough. "He's big." "He's trained," Elias replied. Frank nodded too quickly. Good." He turned back to the panel, hands trembling just enough to be noticeable. As Elias walked away, Morrow's head turned, tracking Frank until the corridor bent out of sight. Then the dog stopped and refused to move. His body went rigid, tail low, nose lifting as he drew in the air through his mouth. His chest vibrated with a soft, barely audible sound. Not a growl, not a whine. Something in between. Something old. Elias crouched beside him, placing a steady hand on the dog's shoulder. The fur beneath his palm was warm, solid, alive. "Easy," he murmured. Morrow did not look at him. His gaze remained fixed on the corridor behind them, eyes dark and intent, as if he were seeing not what stood there now, but what had once filled that space. For a long moment, neither of them moved. That evening, Elias returned to his apartment with a sense that the building itself was watching him. The walls held their silence carefully. The vents whispered softly as air moved through them, carrying with it faint traces of scent, cleaning chemicals layered over something older. Burned insulation, melted plastic. Elias could not smell it, not consciously, but Morrow could. The dog paused near one of the vents, inhaled, then turned away, unsettled. Elias sat on the couch as dusk settled into night, the sky outside fading from blue to steel. He thought about Frank's reaction, about Colin's evasions, about Lang's smooth insistence that the past remained sealed. None of them had spoken of guilt. None of them had admitted fear. But Elias recognized the pattern as clearly as a map. They were not protecting themselves from Elias. They were protecting themselves from what they had allowed to happen. When the clock on the wall crept closer to midnight, Elias did not look at it. He did not need to. He felt the building's rhythms now, the way systems shifted and settled. He understood, instinctively, that confronting these people directly would only harden their silence. Responsibility was a weight they had avoided for years. Dropping it suddenly into their hands would not make them stronger. It would make them run. So Elias chose patience. He stood at the window, one hand resting lightly on Morrow's head, as the dog settled beside him. Outside, the city glowed softly, unaware of the truths pressed into its foundations. Elias knew the answers he needed would not come from daylight conversations or legal warnings. They would come at 3:17, when systems reset, when guards relaxed, when memory stirred. Silence, he understood now, was not always cruelty. Sometimes it was cowardice that had learned to survive. Elias Crow did not rush the seventh night. He prepared for it the way he once prepared for operations that mattered, not with ceremony, but with intention. He cleaned the apartment again, though it was already clean, moving slowly through each room, as if learning the shape of the space by heart. He fed Morrow earlier than usual, then sat on the floor beside him, resting his back against the couch, breathing in time with the steady rise and fall of the dog's chest. The building around them had settled into its nighttime rhythm, pipes ticking softly as heat redistributed, distant doors closing, footsteps thinning into absence. By the time the digital clock crept toward the hour he had been waiting for, Elias felt neither fear nor anticipation, only readiness. When the numbers changed to 3:17, the air shifted almost imperceptibly. The lights flickered once, no more than a blink, and somewhere deep in the structure, an old system reset itself with a sound like a restrained sigh. Elias stood, tall and grounded, his movements economical. Morrow rose with him, positioning himself slightly behind and to the side, close enough that Elias could feel the dog's warmth without looking. The key felt heavier than it should have in Elias's palm, worn smooth by hands that had once turned it with equal care. The lock yielded without resistance this time. The door opened inward on silent hinges. The room beyond was not what Elias had expected, though he could not have said what he had expected. There was no stench of decay, no sense of intrusion. Instead, the space felt preserved, cool, orderly, stripped of anything unnecessary. Shelving lined the walls, metal and wood combined with utilitarian precision. File boxes were stacked neatly, each labeled in a careful, deliberate hand. A fireproof safe sat against the far wall, its surface scarred but intact. On a small table near the center lay an album, its cover worn soft with age, and beside it a stack of envelopes tied with faded twine. A cassette player rested at the edge of the table, its plastic casing yellowed slightly, the kind of machine that belonged to another era but had been kept functional out of stubbornness rather than nostalgia. This was not a place where secrets were hidden. It was a place where they were kept. Elias stepped inside slowly, the soles of his boots making no sound against the floor. Morrow followed, then stopped just past the threshold. His posture changed immediately. His ears remained forward, but his body tensed, muscles along his shoulders and spine tightening, as if bracing against an unseen current. His breathing deepened, not fast but deliberate. The scent in the room, faint, old, layered, reached him all at once. Elias noticed the way the dog's gaze drifted, not settling on any one object, but moving across the shelves as if tracking something absent rather than present. Elias approached the table and picked up the cassette. The label was handwritten, 3:17. He slid it into the player and pressed play. The tape whirred, then crackled softly before a voice filled the room. Arthur Hale's voice was older than Elias remembered it, roughened by years and restrained emotion. It was the voice of a man who had learned to speak carefully, because careless words had once cost lives. "If you're hearing this," Arthur said, "then you waited." There was a pause, long enough to feel intentional. People think fire kills. It doesn't. Smoke does. Confusion does. Locked doors do. Arthur described the night of the fire without dramatics. The alarm that sounded too late. The hallway that filled too quickly. The doors that should have opened and didn't. He spoke of 3:17 as a moment suspended, not because time stopped, but because everything that followed could have been prevented. People had not died screaming. They had died reaching for exits that failed them. "I documented it," Arthur continued. "All of it. and then I was told to change it." His voice tightened just slightly. "They didn't threaten me. They didn't have to. They talked about budgets, about liability, about panic. They told me the truth would do more harm than the lie." Elias felt his jaw tighten. "I kept copies," Arthur said. "Maintenance logs, door replacement schedules, names. I sealed this room legally, not to expose anyone, not yet. I wasn't looking for justice. I was waiting for responsibility." The tape clicked off. Elias stood there for a long moment, the silence heavier now for having been interrupted. Arthur had not sounded angry. He had sounded tired and resolute. Elias moved to the shelves, pulling a file at random. Inside were inspection reports, some original, some altered. The differences were subtle: changed dates, replaced signatures, revised conclusions that smoothed rough edges into acceptable narratives. Elias recognized the pattern immediately. This was not the work of one villain. It was the work of a system protecting itself. He opened the album next. Inside were photographs, families smiling in better light, children caught mid-laugh, a woman leaning into a man's shoulder. Lives before smoke and darkness reduced them to statistics. Elias turned the pages slowly, aware that each image carried a gravity he had no right to rush. Behind him, Morrow let out a sound. Not a bark, not a growl. A low, breathy whine escaped his chest before he seemed to catch himself. The dog moved forward, ignoring Elias entirely, drawn toward the far corner of the room. There, on a lower shelf, sat a small cardboard box. Inside it lay a worn leather collar, cracked with age, its buckle dulled by heat. Morrow stopped inches from it. His body trembled, not violently, but unmistakably. His tail lowered, his head dipped. He inhaled slowly, deeply, drawing the scent into himself as if confirming something he had never fully lost. Elias approached cautiously. He knelt beside Morrow, watching as the dog extended his nose and touched the collar once, gently. His ears flattened slightly, not in fear, but in memory. His breathing hitched, then steadied. Something passed through the room then, not a sound, not a presence, but a weight. Elias felt it settle behind his ribs, heavy and unmistakable. Morrow had been here before. Not as he was now, steady and trained and controlled, but younger, in smoke, in chaos, searching. Elias rested a hand on the dog's shoulder, grounding them both. He did not speak. There were no words that belonged in that moment. He returned to the files, opening the fireproof safe with the combination written on the inside of Arthur's notebook. Inside were duplicates, insurance correspondence, internal memos, photographs of doors replaced after the fire with cheaper models, their serial numbers recorded with obsessive care. Arthur had not trusted memory alone, he had trusted evidence. Elias understood now why the room had remained sealed. Arthur had built a legal sanctuary, one that used the system's own rules to protect what it wanted buried. No one had dared violate it without risking exposure. This room was not a confession, it was a waiting place. Elias closed the safe and stepped back, surveying the space with new understanding. The room did not feel ominous anymore. It felt patient, as if it had been holding its breath, waiting for someone willing to listen without trying to own the truth it contained. Morrow sat beside him again, closer this time, his posture calmer but changed. The dog was not guarding the door now, he was staying. Elias glanced at the clock mounted inside the room. It read 3:24. Time had resumed. Elias turned off the cassette player, careful with the tape, and replaced it where it belonged. He did not take anything with him. Not yet. This was not a raid. It was an introduction. As he stepped back into the hallway and closed the door behind him, locking it once more, Elias understood something with a clarity that felt almost gentle. This room was not a secret. It was a promise. Elias Crow began to live by the clock again, though not in the way he once had in uniform. These nights were quieter, heavier. After midnight, when the building settled into a sleep that was more habit than rest, he unlocked the room at 3:17 and worked until the faint gray of morning pressed against the windows. He did not rush. He read the way he had learned to clear rooms, methodically, with respect for what might still be hidden. The room no longer felt strange. It felt purposeful, like a space designed not for revelation, but for endurance. The files revealed themselves slowly. Maintenance logs first, then inspection reports, then handwritten notes tucked into folders where they did not belong. Elias learned to recognize Arthur Hale's handwriting immediately. Precise, angular, disciplined. The script of a man who believed clarity was a moral obligation. Beside it were other signatures, looser, rushed, sometimes copied poorly enough that even a tired eye could spot the inconsistencies. Dates were changed by a day here, a week there. Replacement schedules were moved forward or back just enough to obscure causality. The work was subtle. It relied on the assumption that no one would ever look closely again. One list stopped him cold. A typed inventory of emergency exits, printed less than 2 weeks before the fire, showed serial numbers for locking mechanisms installed throughout the building. Elias cross-referenced it with a second document, an updated list dated after the fire. Several numbers no longer matched. The locks had been replaced, not repaired, replaced. And the originals had vanished from record. Elias sat back in his chair, his broad shoulders rolling slightly as he exhaled. Replacing locks on emergency exits without proper disclosure was not negligence. It was intent. He dug deeper. A maintenance calendar lay folded inside a binder, the paper creased and worn from being handled too often. The handwriting that altered it was not Arthur's. The strokes were heavier, more impatient. A signature had been added at the bottom, Arthur Hale's name. But Elias compared it to earlier samples and felt a familiar tightening in his chest. The angles were wrong, the pressure inconsistent. Someone had traced it. Poorly. Arthur had tried to tell the truth. The photographs came next. Grainy, printed on cheap paper, tucked into a plain envelope with no label. Elias spread them across the table under the single overhead light. They showed a hallway late at night, illuminated by emergency lighting. Smoke hung low, thick enough to blur edges. In one frame, partially obscured by haze, stood a man wearing a maintenance uniform and an ID badge clipped to his chest. The badge was wrong, the color band outdated, the logo no longer in use at the time the photo was taken. A fake. Elias felt the shape of the story come together, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet certainty. The fire had not been chaos. It had been managed. The locked doors, the altered reports, the manufactured conclusion of accident. Insurance payouts followed neatly after, routed through layers of liability protection and legal distance. No single villain, just enough people willing to look away. Behind him, Morrow shifted. The dog had taken to lying near the entrance of the room during these nights, his body angled toward the shelves, his head resting on his paws. He did not sleep deeply here. Elias could tell by the way his ears moved, how his eyes opened at the slightest change in sound. Tonight, Morrow rose and walked slowly along the wall, nose close to the lower shelves. His tail remained still, his movements deliberate. He stopped at one section and sat. Elias followed his gaze. There, among the files, sat another box Elias had not opened yet. Smaller, unassuming. He crouched and lifted the lid. Inside were laminated certificates, brittle with age, and a folded vest, high-visibility orange, darkened by smoke stains that no amount of washing could fully erase. The lettering on the vest was faded but legible. Search and Rescue, Canine Unit. Morrow stepped forward, sniffing the fabric. His posture softened just slightly, not relaxed, remembering. His ears tilted outward, no longer rigid, and he lowered his head until his nose brushed the vest. Elias watched as the dog's breathing changed, deep and slow, the way it did when memory overtook training. This was no coincidence. Elias found the final confirmation in a personnel file tucked beneath the vest. A photograph showed a younger Morrow, leaner, eyes brighter, sitting beside a firefighter in turnout gear. The man's face was tired, but smiling, one hand resting on the dog's shoulder with unmistakable pride. The date stamped on the file matched the year of the fire. Morrow had not wandered into Elias's life by chance. He had survived something Elias had not known to ask about. The realization settled heavily. Morrow's reactions, the hallway, the vents, the collar, were not instincts sharpened by imagination. They were memories stored in muscle and scent, responses trained and reinforced under pressure. The dog did not sense ghosts. He remembered work unfinished. Elias returned to the files with renewed clarity. Arthur Hale's final reports were there too, marked unsubmitted. They detailed locked exits, altered maintenance schedules, and interference from oversight committees more concerned with financial exposure than human cost. Arthur had signed the final public report under protest, his objections buried in appendices no one had read. Elias imagined the moment. Arthur sitting at a desk much like this one, pen heavy in his hand, understanding exactly what refusing would cost and what compliance would save. Arthur had chosen delay, not surrender. As dawn approached, Elias closed the last folder and leaned back, rubbing a hand over his beard. He was no longer angry. Anger required simplicity. What he felt now was responsibility, cold, steady, unavoidable. He understood why Arthur had sealed this room, why he had waited for someone who would not monetize the truth or weaponize it for attention. This was not evidence meant to explode. It was evidence meant to be returned. Elias looked at Morrow, who had settled beside him again, posture calm but alert. The dog met his gaze briefly, eyes steady, then looked back toward the shelves as if reminding Elias that the work was not finished. "I won't keep it," Elias said quietly. Morrow's ears flicked. Elias did not know yet who would receive which pieces of the truth. He only knew that keeping it locked away, even with good intentions, would turn Arthur's patience into complicity. The files were not meant for courts alone. They were meant for people, the ones who had lived with questions for years, the ones who had learned to be silent because silence was easier than grief. When Elias locked the room again just before sunrise, the gesture felt different, less like sealing, more like promising. He rested his hand against the door for a moment longer than necessary, then turned away. Fire, he understood now, had never been the enemy. It had only been the tool. Elias Crow chose a morning with soft light to visit Miriam Holt. He did not call ahead. Some things, he had learned, were better received without warning, when the heart had no time to armor itself. Her house stood at the edge of town, a modest, single-story place with white siding that had yellowed gently with age. The porch steps sagged slightly in the middle, worn down by years of careful feet. A single wind chime hung by the door, its sound thin and hesitant, as if unsure it was still welcome. Miriam Holt opened the door herself. She was in her early 70s, small in frame but not fragile, her posture straight in a way that spoke of long-held endurance rather than strength. Her hair was silver white and pulled back into a loose knot, wisps escaping around her temples. Her skin was pale and finely lined, the lines not sharp with bitterness, but softened by time and restraint. Her eyes, light gray, almost translucent, held the quiet alertness of someone who slept lightly and remembered too much. "Yes," she said, her voice measured, polite, already guarded. "My name is Elias Crow," he replied, keeping his tone even. "I'm sorry to come without notice. I believe I have something that belongs to you." Her gaze dropped briefly to Morrow, who sat beside Elias, calm and composed, his large frame a reassuring presence rather than an intrusion. Something in her expression shifted then, not recognition, not fear, but a subtle opening, as though an old door had been tested and found not entirely rusted shut. She stepped aside without another word. Inside, the house smelled faintly of tea and old books. Everything was tidy, not meticulously so, but maintained with care. Framed photographs lined one wall. Holidays, school portraits, a young man in a borrowed suit standing stiffly beside a woman who looked impossibly proud. Elias recognized him immediately from the album in the evidence room. Younger, unburned by memory. Miriam gestured to the kitchen table and sat opposite Elias, folding her hands in her lap. Her fingers were long and thin, knuckles pronounced, bearing the quiet marks of arthritis. She did not ask why he was there. She waited. Elias placed the bundle of letters on the table between them. The twine had been replaced with a fresh ribbon, simple and unassuming. "These were never delivered," he said. "They were written by your son." Miriam did not reach for them at first. Her breathing changed, shallow for a moment, then steadied. When she finally lifted her hands, they trembled, just enough to betray the effort it took to remain composed. She untied the ribbon slowly, reverently, as if rushing might undo the moment entirely. The first envelope bore her name in careful handwriting. "Oh," she whispered. The sound barely carried, but it landed with weight. She read in silence. Elias did not watch her face. He watched Morrow instead, who had shifted closer to the table and now lay with his head resting on his paws, eyes half-lidded, present but unobtrusive. The room felt fuller, as though something long absent had been allowed back in. When Miriam spoke again, her voice was steadier. "They told me there was nothing left," she said. "They said the fire took everything." Elias nodded. It didn't. Tears came then, quietly, without drama. They traced the lines of her face and fell onto the paper, blurring ink that had waited years for this exact moment. She did not apologize for them. She read every letter. When Elias left, Miriam stood in the doorway and placed a hand briefly on Morrow's head. Her touch was tentative but sincere. "Thank you for bringing him home," she said, though she did not clarify which him she meant. That afternoon, Elias drove to the edge of town, where the fire station stood like a relic from a sturdier time. Daniel Reeves met him outside. Daniel was in his late 40s, tall but slightly stooped, his broad shoulders sloping forward as if under a weight he had never learned to set down. His hair was cut short and prematurely gray, his beard thick but neatly kept. His face was deeply lined around the eyes and mouth, not with age, but with nights spent staring at ceilings, replaying moments that could not be changed. He shook Elias's hand firmly, then looked at Morrow with something like hesitation. "I've seen dogs like him before," Daniel said, "on the worst nights." Morrow met his gaze steadily, tail still, posture neutral. They sat on the back steps of the station, the afternoon sun warming the concrete beneath them. Daniel spoke slowly at first, choosing his words with care. He described the night of the fire, not in grand gestures, but in fragments. The alarm that came too late. The hallway that filled faster than training accounted for. The doors that would not open, no matter how hard they were pushed. "I can still feel the handle," Daniel said quietly. "Hot. Not burning, just wrong." His hands clenched unconsciously as he spoke. Morrow shifted closer, his body angling toward Daniel, not touching, but near enough that their shoulders almost brushed. The dog's presence was steady, grounding. Daniel's voice broke only once. "I left people behind," he said. "I tell myself I didn't. I tell myself I couldn't get to them. But every night at 3:17, I wake up knowing exactly where they were." At that moment, Morrow lifted his head and let out a low, soft sound. Not distress, not warning. Recognition. He pressed his side gently against Daniel's leg, weight firm and real. Daniel inhaled sharply, then exhaled, his shoulders dropping for the first time since Elias had met him. He reached out without looking and rested a hand against the dog's back. "You were there," he murmured. Morrow did not move away. As days passed, Elias began to notice a change in the apartment, not in its structure, but in its presence. Each time a letter was returned, a story spoken aloud, the space felt less tense. The air moved more freely. At 317, the building no longer felt like it was holding its breath. It felt as though it was releasing it. Miriam called Daniel. Daniel called another family. Names once avoided were spoken again, tentatively at first, then with growing steadiness. The connections formed quietly, without announcements or headlines. Grief found companions. Silence began to loosen its grip. Elias watched it happen from the edges, never placing himself at the center. This was not his justice. It was theirs. One night, standing in the dim light of the hallway, Elias rested his hand against the locked door and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Lightness. Not relief, not yet, but the first easing of a burden carried too long by too many. Morrow sat beside him, eyes soft, posture relaxed. For the first time in years, something had been returned. The pressure began quietly, the way most deliberate things do. Letters arrived first, formal, carefully worded notices citing inspections, compliance reviews, temporary access orders. Elias Crow read them once and filed them away without comment. Then came the phone calls, always polite, always insistent, always framed as concern. Victor Lang's voice appeared again, smoother than before, carrying the practiced patience of a man who believed time would eventually wear down resistance. He spoke of liability, of mounting risk, of how easily a private citizen could be overwhelmed by procedure if he chose the wrong hill to stand on. Elias listened, then ended the calls. He had seen this pattern before. In other lives, other wars, when an opponent realized you were no longer alone, they stopped trying to persuade you and started trying to isolate you. The building changed around him in subtle ways. Cameras that had worked reliably began to flicker, their feeds cutting out for seconds at a time. A motion sensor near the stairwell failed twice in 1 week. Maintenance logs showed scheduled checks that no one remembered performing. None of it was dramatic. All of it was intentional. Morrow noticed first. The dog's behavior shifted during their nightly walks through the corridors. His ears remained forward longer. His pace slowed near the stairwell, his nose lifting, testing the air. He stopped once in front of a utility closet and refused to move until Elias opened the door and confirmed it was empty. His reactions were not anxious, they were precise. This was the vigilance of a working dog, recognizing a pattern he had been trained to interrupt. Elias took that as his cue. He spent the next 2 nights in the evidence room, not reading, but copying. He photographed documents, scanned handwritten notes, and duplicated digital records stored on outdated drives Arthur Hale had preserved with stubborn foresight. He worked efficiently, his movements economical, his mind calm. When the copies were complete, he encrypted them, layering protections the way he once layered defenses around positions that mattered. He sent the files in segments, each one meaningless on its own, to a single recipient. Nora Bell. Nora was a local journalist in her late 30s, tall and spare, with sharp cheekbones and dark hair usually pulled back in a loose ponytail that suggested practicality over vanity. Her skin bore the faint freckles of someone who spent time outdoors, and her eyes, brown, steady, missed very little. She had built her reputation not on speed, but on patience. She was known for waiting until a story could no longer be buried, then writing it so cleanly that denial became impossible. When Elias met her briefly at a quiet cafe, she did not ask how he had obtained the files. She did not promise anything. She simply said, "If this is what you think it is, I'll protect it," and meant it. That night, Elias did not sleep. At 3:17, the fire alarm screamed. The sound tore through the building with brutal urgency, sharp and insistent, echoing down hallways that had once filled with smoke and panic. Red lights flashed, painting the walls and pulsing warnings. Elias was on his feet instantly, adrenaline cutting through fatigue with familiar precision. Morrow was already moving, his body angled toward the door, ready. Smoke seeped under the hallway doors, thin at first, then thickening with alarming speed. The smell was unmistakable: burning plastic, insulation, something electrical gone wrong. Elias stepped into the corridor and felt the air clawed his lungs. The past had returned, not as memory, but as threat. Shouts echoed from down the hall. Doors opened. Someone cried out in confusion. The building's emergency lights flickered, then steadied, casting long shadows that warped familiar shapes into something uncertain. Elias moved fast, scanning as he went. That was when he saw Daniel Reeves. Daniel stood halfway down the corridor, frozen. His broad frame blocked part of the passage, his shoulders hunched, his hands pressed flat against the wall. Smoke curled around him, and his eyes, wide, unfocused, stared at nothing Elias could see. His chest rose and fell too quickly, breath shallow and panicked. He was no longer in the present. He was back in the fire, back at the locked doors, back at the moment he had never escaped. "Daniel!" Elias called, his voice steady, cutting through the alarm. Daniel did not respond. Morrow surged forward, leash slipping loose from Elias's hand.
The dog did not bark. He ran straight to Daniel and pressed his body firmly against the man's legs, weight solid and undeniable. His presence was grounding, physical, impossible to ignore. He looked up at Daniel and let out a single sharp exhale, a trained signal Elias recognized instantly, a command to focus, to return. Daniel's gaze flickered. He blinked once, then again. His breath stuttered, then slowed. "There," Elias said, stepping in close. He placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, firm, anchoring. "You're here. You're with us." Daniel nodded, once, mechanically, then again with more certainty. I couldn't move," he rasped. "I know," Elias said. "You don't have to. I've got you." From the far end of the corridor, footsteps approached. Too deliberate, too coordinated. Shapes moved through the smoke, staying close to the walls. Elias caught a glimpse of reflective strips that didn't match firefighter gear, of faces half covered by scarves. Not responders, they were headed for the evidence room. Elias made a choice without hesitation. He turned Daniel toward the stairwell, guiding him forward. "Down," he said, "now." Morrow stayed with Daniel, positioning himself between the man and the smoke, herding him with practiced precision. Elias moved in the opposite direction, toward the locked door, his heart steady despite the chaos. The men reached the hallway intersection just as Elias did. They hesitated when they saw him, tall, unmoving, his stance unmistakably controlled. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. Morrow reappeared then, placing himself squarely in front of the evidence room door. His teeth showed, not in aggression, but in warning. His body was rigid, every line of him broadcasting resolve. The men backed off. Sirens wailed outside, growing louder. The unmistakable rumble of fire engines shook the pavement. Blue and red lights strobed through the windows, slicing through smoke and darkness alike. Firefighters flooded the building moments later, faces masked, movements efficient. They pushed past Elias without question, responding to the call with the kind of competence born of repetition and loss. Within minutes, hoses were uncoiled, the source of the fire contained. A sabotaged electrical panel near the stairwell, set to ignite at the exact moment the building's systems reset. The damage was limited. The message was not. Outside, wrapped in a blanket, Daniel sat on the curb, his breathing finally even. Elias stood nearby, Morrow pressed against his leg, the dog's sides rising and falling with calm assurance. The night air was sharp, cold enough to sting the lungs clean. Victor Lang did not appear. But Elias knew this was not the end. It was an escalation. He looked up at the building,
smoke curling from a broken window like a final, frustrated breath. Somewhere inside, the evidence room remained sealed, untouched, waiting. The truth had survived. Not because it was hidden, but because someone had chosen a life over it. The investigation did not arrive like a storm. It came the way winter did in the north, slow, inevitable, announced first by subtle changes that only those who paid attention would notice. Unmarked cars appeared along the street, parked too neatly to belong to neighbors. Men and women in plain coats moved through the building with quiet authority, their questions precise, their notebooks already heavy with names. The evidence did not need drama to stand. It had weight all on its own. Elias Crow was interviewed twice. He answered carefully, not defensively, his posture straight, his voice even. He did not exaggerate. He did not speculate. He simply placed the truth where it belonged and stepped back. Investigators listened, not with suspicion, but with the measured seriousness of people who understood they were standing on ground long avoided. The copied files, the encrypted records sent to Nora Bell, the camera footage salvaged from failing systems, all of it aligned. Patterns emerged, timelines locked into place. What had once been dismissed as an accident now read like intent stretched thin and disguised by procedure. Victor Lang's name surfaced early. It did not surprise Elias. Lang appeared in records as he had in life, adjacent, never central, always just far enough from the act to claim professional distance. When questioned, Lang maintained his composure, his tailored suit and careful beard unchanged, but the ease had left his eyes. The story he had rehearsed for years faltered under documentation he could not charm away. Others followed, maintenance supervisors, compliance officers, individuals who had signed forms they claimed not to remember reading. Responsibility, once scattered, began to collect. Miriam Holt received the call on a quiet afternoon. She stood in her kitchen, sunlight spilling across the same table where she had read her son's letters, and listened as an official voice confirmed what she had known but never been allowed to prove. Her son had not panicked. He had not been careless. He had been trapped. The doors had been locked. The smoke had come too fast. When the call ended, she did not cry. She sat down slowly and pressed her hand flat against the wood, grounding herself in something solid. Later, when Elias visited, she hugged him without asking permission, her arms thin but strong, her voice steady when she said, "Now I can speak his name without wondering." Other families followed. Quiet meetings, closed doors, tears shed without spectacle. The truth moved through the community, not like fire, but like water, finding every crack, seeping into places that had been dry for too long. Names were spoken aloud again. Photographs were taken down, then placed back with care. Grief, once isolated, found company. Daniel Reeves slept through the night for the first time in years. He told Elias this in the simplest way possible, standing outside the fire station as dawn broke, his hair uncombed, his eyes clearer than Elias had ever seen them. He did not describe dreams. He did not offer thanks. He just said, "I didn't wake up at 3:17, and nodded as if that explained everything. Morrow waited beside him, posture relaxed, tail loose, his head occasionally lifting to follow a passing sound before settling again. The tension that had lived in his frame since the second fire attempt had eased, not vanished, but softened, like a muscle finally allowed to rest. The adoption papers were a formality. Elias filled them out in a quiet office that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpet. The clerk, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and kind hands, glanced at Morrow and smiled. "He looks like he's already home," she said. "He is," Elias replied. When the last signature was placed, Elias felt a shift that had nothing to do with legality. Morrow was no longer a survivor waiting for purpose. He was a companion who had found continuity. The dog leaned into Elias's leg as they left the building, his weight easy, familiar. The door to the evidence room was opened one final time during daylight. There was no resistance, no ceremony. The lock turned smoothly, as though acknowledging that its task was complete. Investigators cataloged what remained, photographing shelves that no longer felt tense, sealing boxes that had once been guarded by silence. When they finished, the room was left empty, clean, ordinary. Elias stood in the doorway alone after they left, his hand resting briefly against the frame. The room felt different now, not hollow, not abandoned, complete. It had done what it was built to do. It no longer needed to wait. Arthur Hale's legacy clarified itself then, not as a man's final act, but as a long-held decision. He had not left Elias a home. He had left him stewardship, the responsibility to hold memory long enough for others to be ready, then to let it go. Outside, the city resumed its familiar rhythms. Children rode bicycles past the building again. The cafe on the corner reopened its patio. Conversations returned to weather, to work, to ordinary complaints that felt almost celebratory in their normalcy. The North had a way of absorbing what had happened without forgetting it. The scars remained, but they were no longer hidden. On a quiet evening, Elias and Morrow walked along the lake as the sun dipped low, the water reflecting bands of orange and steel blue. The air was cold enough to sharpen thought, clean enough to breathe deeply. Elias stopped and watched the ripples spread where a stone skipped across the surface. He thought of the room that no longer needed to be locked, of the letters delivered, of the man who slept through the hour that once owned him, of the dog at his side, breathing easy. Memory, he understood now, was not a burden meant to crush the living. It was a bridge, and some doors, once opened, did not need to be closed again. Sometimes the miracle is not the fire that parts the darkness, but the quiet moment when truth is allowed to breathe again. God does not always arrive in thunder. Often, he comes in patience, in memory, in the courage to open a door we were told to keep closed. In our daily lives, we all carry rooms like that, memories locked away, grief set aside, truths we postponed because we were not ready. But healing begins when we trust that God's timing is not meant to hide the truth, only to prepare our hearts to receive it. If this story touched you, it may be because God is gently reminding you, what you remember with love can still save someone today. A word, a letter, a choice to stand for what is right, even quietly. If you believe stories like this matter, please share it with someone who may need hope tonight. Leave a comment below and tell us what stayed with you. And consider subscribing to this channel so we can continue telling stories about loyalty, healing, and the quiet miracles that walk beside us every day. May God bless you, protect those you love, and grant you peace in the moments that still wait to be opened.